So good afternoon, everybody. And once again, thank you for joining the Shir. We are restarting our weekly Shir on Thursdays at 1 p.m. You're always welcome to join. The format usually is a Q&A, which leads to wonderful discussion. Today, we have a special Shir, as I was asked to deliver a Shir on a Mishna as part of the Chief Rabbi's project. So we're going to be learning a Mishna in memory of the late Eric Samson, Rabbi ben David Zichron Livracha. The individual did an incredible amount for our community, in the Jewish community, and also in the South African broader community, and brought great honor to the name of Yiddishkeit and Torah in South Africa and beyond. We wish his wife Sheila and children only the best, and his memory will certainly serve for a blessing. So what are we going to be learning? We are learning, if you want to get your own text as well, it's a short text. It's the 13th Mishnah in the first chapter of Pirkei Avot, Ethics of Our Fathers. This is the Mishna that we're going to be studying today. It's short, but as always, it has a lot of content and meaning in it. This Mishnah begins in one language and shifts to another language. Hear how it works. Hu haya omer, he would often say. This is a common introduction to Mishnahs in the Ethics of Our Fathers, referring to common aphorisms of particular sages, statements that they would make regularly. They were known for them. In this particular case, it's referring to the author of the previous Mishnah, Hillel. Hillel is one of the great sages of Jewish history and of the Mishnah itself. In other words, the Tanoim, the time of the Mishnah, towards the end of the Second Temple era, and Hillel teaches the following idea. This is something he would often say. What is he saying? What would he often say? And here we switch languages and we move into Aramaic, which in a way makes sense because Hillel was actually born in Babylonia in Iraq. His natural language was Aramaic. And he then, at the age of about 40, made Aliyah and came to Israel. His teaching was as follows. Negad Shmo Avad Shmei. One who wishes to spread their name, the word Shem, one who wishes to spread their name. In other words, one who wishes to become famous or become well-known. Avad Shmei will lose his name. That's the first point. The second point. Udolo Moisif, and if somebody does not add and continually increase in the Torah study, Yosef, they will actually find that the Torah study decreases. Third point, Udalo Yalif, and one who opts not to teach others, one who knows and has a knowledge of Torah and chooses not to engage in teaching others this knowledge that they have, K'tol Chayav is deserving of death. It's a very serious offense, in other words. And finally, Hillel concludes this common phrase of his, Udi ishtamesh betago, and one who seeks to benefit personally from the crown of Torah, Cholof, will be passed over from this world. Hillel is, in this particular teaching, the common theme here is clearly humility. And in this we have a very interesting history of Hillel himself. To appreciate it, I want to ask the question as to why this Mishnah is taught in Aramaic. True that Hillel grew up in Iraq and Aramaic was his natural language, but that wasn't the language of the Mishnah. It's not the language of his teaching in the earlier Mishnah in 12, and not his language in the next Mishnah in 14. Here, he somehow reverts to Aramaic. How come? Why is he speaking what is essentially a lower language and not speaking the original holy tongue of Hebrew? That's the first thing. So to appreciate it, there is a very interesting history to this particular teaching of Hillel. First of all, who was Hillel? Hillel is considered in the Talmud to be the greatest, most humble individual in the Talmud. He is a paragon of patience and of humility. He was exceptionally poor. His zeal and desire to study Torah reached proportions where he was literally risked his life to be able to study Torah. and he is known for a patience that is simply endless. In fact, he's compared to Moses, who was called the most humble person that ever lived. According to Kabbalah, Hillel is a reincarnation of Moses, which is why in the earlier teaching, he says, be a student of Aaron. Because, of course, Aaron was the older brother of Moses. So he was a reincarnation. His soul was a reincarnation of Moshe Rabbeinu. However, in Hillel's teaching us that there is this imperative of humility. If you seek to spread your name, you will lose your name. There is a bit of a history of Hillel himself slipping up. According to the Gemara in Pesachim, Hillel became famous when he came to Israel, came to Jerusalem. We're talking about a bit over 100 years before the destruction of the Second Temple. And there, the community was faced with a particularly difficult question relating to Pesach that fell out on Sunday. Erev Pesach was on Shabbos. Erev Pesach is when the Paschal sacrifice was offered, and it hadn't been done in a number of years, these two coinciding, and there were uncertainties amongst the leading rabbis as to how to conduct the service. Hillel stepped in and displayed an incredible knowledge and was immediately elected the head of the academy. That was the humility of the sages who were there. They recognized his superior knowledge, even though he came from a lower land, literally, the land of Iraq. But his knowledge was superior. And so they appointed him the head of the academy. But very quickly, when he became the head of the academy, he resorted to rebuke the sages and told them off. And this was seen as a bit of hubris. The Gemara says that it was a bit of an expression, and his level was inappropriate. And therefore, in fact, he forgot a teaching afterwards relating to the laws of Shabbos. He was punished, so to speak. So Hillel is speaking from personal experience. Hillel experienced a meteoric rise, a very quick zoom to the top. He became the leader of the Jewish people, and indeed remains still today one of the most influential leaders of the Jewish people. And in that, he recognized that there is a danger, that when one's name is spread, there is a danger that one can become somewhat self-focused, arrogant, and therefore he says that you should know that if you seek to have your name spread, you will in fact lose your name. That's the punishment for it. There's a beautiful reading of this by one of the classic commentators of Pirkei Avot, of Ethics of Our Fathers, Midrash Shul. Midrash Shul says, he reads it like this. He says, one who wishes their name to spread far and wide, in other words, one who wishes to be influential in the teachings of Torah, Avad Shmei must lose their name. In other words, must completely humble themselves. And only when one is able to humble themselves truly will one find that their name can spread in a positive, influential way of teaching Torah. You can't have them both. There's a lovely story told about the Chayza of Lublin, one of the most influential Hasidic rabbis in Poland in the 19th century, was Rabbi Yaakov Yitzchak of Lublin. He was known as the visionary, the seer of Lublin. There was also another rabbi in Lublin, the non-Hasidic rabbi, Rabbi Zalacharif, who was a great scholar as well. And he was puzzled by the great honor that was given to the Chayza. So he challenged him in it. He said, what is this? You're a Rebbe. And I see that it's an accomplishment like all other accomplishments. It's a desire like all other desires. You simply have risen to a point of prominence. And look at the honor that you're getting. So the Chayza said, what should I do? I don't want it. He said, tell the people that they got the wrong guy. If you let the people know that you're not worthy of such honor, and that you're in fact not so great as a Torah scholar as they think, and you're not some visionary as they think, and you're not prophet, then they'll realize that it was a false bill of goods, and they'll leave you. Well, what do you know? In the next Shabbos, the Chayza got up in Shul, and he made this announcement. He announced exactly what his colleague had told him. He's not worthy. He's the wrong guy. They must find a real rabbi, a real rav, a real tzaddik, and they must go and have a relationship with him, not with the Chayza. What do you think happened? The reaction was exactly the opposite of what he expected. People were so wowed by the Chayza's humility that more people flocked to him than ever. More and more came. So suddenly, he was not only great and learned and perceptive, he was humble.
So when they met up again, Aizal Echarif, his colleague, says to him, "What's going on? You don't seem to have diminished the adulation that you get." He says, "What should I do? I made the announcement, and now they think I'm humble." So his colleague said to him, "I'll tell you what you should do. Get up in Shul and tell them that you're indeed very great. You should announce that you're the greatest that there is. There hasn't been such a great rabbi in years. And that your learning is unsurpassed, and that your piety is unsurpassed, and your vision is unsurpassed. I don't believe you." So the Chayzer said to him, "Listen, it's a very good suggestion." He said, "There's one problem." He said, "For me to announce that would be telling a lie." He said, "Telling a lie I'm not willing to do in Shul." Tell a story with the Chofetz Chaim, one of the great sages in Poland and Lithuania in the 20th century, that there was a fellow who lived in the area who was very desperate to reach some sort of prominence. He had read somewhere that when you flee honor, honor pursues you. And so he adopted a manner and a behavioral pattern of fleeing honor intensely. It was a bit odd. His behavior was that anytime you gave him an aliyah, he said, no, not for me. I don't want an aliyah. They offered him to lead the service. No, not for me. You want to say a word? Not for me. Would you like to give tzedakah? No, I'm nobody. He was a nobody. He ran away from any possible recognition, from any possible role. If they called his name out, he ran away. But guess what? Everybody thought he was a meshugana. Nobody actually followed him. Suddenly, honor didn't pursue him. So he came to the great Chofetz Chaim with a complaint. Here is the teaching of Maimer Chazal, a teaching of our sages, and yet it's not working. You understand? Somehow he's fleeing honor with all his might. It's not pursuing him. So Mr. Chofetz Chaim wisely said, it's true. I can see that you flee honor. He says, but the problem is that you keep turning your head back to look behind you to see if it's following you. That's why it's not following you. If you stop looking behind you, it'll come after you as well. And so Hillel, in this point, Hillel, who is the great humble sage of the Talmud, teaches us that in order for your name to spread, it will can affect your sense of self and the ability to sort of operate, because it becomes about self, then it becomes less attractive. And in fact, one's name is lost, as happened to Hillel in some fashion. And this explains to us the theme of the next teachings. Because what Hillel's saying is that you're going to say, okay, I don't want to become arrogant, so I'll stop learning Torah. I've achieved a certain level of Torah study, but I don't want to continue because then I'm going to get arrogant. He says, no. If you stop developing your Torah study, you're not only not going to develop more, you're going to lose what you learned earlier. Just like oxygen, you can't take a break from oxygen. You can't take a break from life. You cannot take a break from Torah. Torah is something that has to be constant. You have to grow. There's a story with the Mitzvah Rebbe, one of the great Hasidic sages in the early 19th century, who used to encourage his students to teach over, wherever they traveled, to give a teaching of the Hasidic teachings that they had studied by the Rebbe. One said that he feels that he's becoming arrogant. He's teaching, and people are enjoying it and complimenting him, and he feels that he's developing an arrogance, to which his Rebbe said to him, listen, you should become an onion. An onion grows with the head down on the ground. You should become a tzibelazol from der Welt. You can see Jaime in Eretz Yisrael is enjoying that. You should be an onion, but never stop saying chassidus. You have to keep teaching. And this is what Hillel is saying here as well. You cannot say that I shouldn't develop my teaching because I might get arrogant. No, you have to balance the two. Develop yourself and make sure to find yourself in the humility. And this is the next teaching. One who does not teach others. One who refuses to share that which they have because they feel, oy vey, I might get arrogant. I may get full of myself. Says Hillel, that is deserving of death. In other words, you're cutting yourself off. You can't do that. You can never refuse to teach another person. The Lubavitcher Rebbe taught that on this Mishna, he said that just as we have somebody who's blessed with abundance of wealth, has an obligation to share it, God gives it to people in order that they share it with others. We are effectively God's bankers. And so based on the amount that we have to share with others, 10%, 20%, sometimes even more. The same thing is with knowledge. When we have been blessed with an opportunity to know something, we have an obligation to share that with others. We don't have the right to keep it to ourselves. And doing so, Hillel says, K'tol Chayev, this actually deserves death. But on the other hand, as you develop, as you grow, as you become a somebody, you have to ensure not to abuse that or to use that for your own personal benefit over the benefit of the community itself. And that is, I think, one of the most important teachings psychologically. And I'll just add on a relevant point, the tiniest point, where we've seen certain figures who are prominent, either in the rabbinic field, in the medical field, who have become, unfortunately, terrible, terrible abusers, serial abusers even. And it's a very, very disturbing, I wouldn't call it a trend. It's a disturbing phenomenon. And where does it come from? It's something that bothered me greatly. Are people born that way? Do they develop that way? Where does it come from that a person who is in the field of healing children turns into an abuser of children? How does that process happen? Did they go into it initially because of that? There was a talk on the Headlines podcast with Dr. David Pelkowitz, who's visited our shores here a number of times, very prominent psychologist, frum psychologist. And Dr. Pelkowitz explained that when one is dealing with a narcissistic personality, that individual starts off with a certain sense of humility or even altruism. But as their success grows, they become emboldened and it becomes about them. And as it becomes about them, they begin to abuse others because it feeds into that sense of power. So it's a very scary thought that every one of us can develop, God forbid, into something that we never imagined we could be. That the very pursuit of helping somebody else can actually, in a psychological way, if not very carefully tended, develop into something very dangerous, a predator. And this is what Hillel concludes his Mishna with. He concludes the Mishna by saying that yes, you should achieve greatness. You should learn Torah and you should teach Torah, and you should teach Torah in a way that people are impressed and moved and connected and inspired. But never let that success in any way, God forbid, lead you to a sense of your own infallibility, of your own primacy. We are simply, each one of us, as I said earlier, with money, bankers. We are bankers, whether we are bankers of money that we have to then hand out as Hashem gave us, or we are bankers of knowledge, as was often expressed by the Rabbi. If you know Aleph, teach somebody Aleph. Whatever one knows, one has an obligation to teach. It is not an option. It is not something that one has a choice as to whether to distribute that knowledge. It is an obligation, as a responsibility. And if we see ourselves as channels of Hashem's teaching and of Hashem's wisdom, then we avoid the pitfall of developing this narcissistic, self-obsessive focus that can lead to terrible situations. I'm not used to talking so long in a monologue. I usually interrupt and see questions, but I'll do that at the end. I want to address my original question, and that is, how come this Mishnah turns to Aramaic rather than the traditional language of the Mishnah, which is in the Lashon HaKodesh, the Holy Tongue Hebrew? So in general, for a student of Talmud, one of the ways to know what one is studying is to look at what language it is. If one is reading a teaching in Talmud in Hebrew, then it is a teaching of the earlier sages of the Mishna era, because their teachings were recorded in Lashon HaKodesh, all of them. When one is reading a teaching and it is in Aramaic, then we generally know we're talking about the Talmudic era, which was recorded, the Babylonian Talmud, a study of a few hundred years, from about the 4th century to about the 6th century, was in Aramaic. So the student of Talmud knows that when you shift to Aramaic, you're dealing with a different era. And yet here we have an earlier era, the Tana, the Mishnah, Hillel, speaking in Aramaic, recorded. He probably did speak Aramaic, but recorded in Aramaic. How come? So I'll share with you a fascinating commentary on the Haggadah. Pesach's not that far away. Interesting that the Haggadah also begins with Aramaic. Haggadah is generally a collection of commentary on verses in the Torah. We're not really sure who the compiler of the Haggadah was, but it goes back certainly to Mishna days, probably earlier, maybe even to Moses himself. But the beginning of the Haggadah, we say in Aramaic, halachmania, right? Or kehalachmania. This is the bread of affliction that our forefathers ate in Egypt. It's a phrase, it's a paragraph in Aramaic. Why are we beginning the entire Haggadah, which will then proceed to be completely in Hebrew, in Aramaic? So the Shalom HaKodesh, one of the great 17th century scholars, taught the following idea. The language of Hebrew is a language of redemption. It's a language of freedom. One of the merits that the Jewish people had to leave Egypt was that they did not change their language. The language of their forefathers, which was the language of Ivri, of the Shon HaKodesh, was in fact their language. It is a language of redemption. It says when the Jews were exiled from Israel during the first temple destruction under the Babylonians, it was a process of about 20 years, 25 years of exile, where the majority of the Jews were then transplanted into Babylonia. The Jews lost their proficiency in the Holy Tongue, and they developed a proficiency in a quasi-Holy Tongue. It's a Semitic language called Aramaic, which is the Talmud is made up, until today is considered an ancient language, and has a strong relationship to Hebrew. But it's not Hebrew. It's a degree down from Hebrew. He says that, and in fact, the Arizal already teaches, that Pesach can be read, phonetically heard, as Pesach, the mouth speaks. Redemption and exile, tzoris and survival, relies on the mouth, on language that we use. When the language was in the language of Hebrew, of the Lashon HaKodesh, it was a time of redemption and openness. Using a language of a lower level indicated that the Jews had been sent into exile. And so that's why we begin, because we're going to leave Egypt, we begin with a sort of lower level language, a language that is quasi-Hebrew, but not Hebrew itself, which represents the Jews in a state of negativity, being a state of exile. And that's Aramaic. So we begin the story of the Haggadah in Aramaic because we're in exile. Our job is to liberate ourselves, to be freed from exile, to leave Egypt. But the state of Egypt, which is the beginning point of the Seder, is in a state of exile. And so therefore we begin in Aramaic and not in Hebrew. So this idea of language, the fact that the Jews lost the language, that's why we suddenly had a composition of prayers. The idea that we have set prayers in a siddur, the Amidah, which we say 3 times a day, all the different blessings, all of that was composed because the Jews had lost their proficiency to speak to God in Hebrew, in the Lashon HaKodesh, in the Holy Tongue. And because of that, it was necessary to form, using that language, a set method of communicating with God in the original language of redemption. Until then, everybody spoke to God in the Hebrew language, in the Lashon HaKodesh, as they felt from their heart. They had the ability to express themselves that way. Not once they went to Babylonia. Once they went down to Iraq, they lost that ability, and so the composition of prayers and blessings was a necessary remedy. So come back to our Mishnah here. Hillel is going into a bit of the morass of the human psyche. This is not a pleasant Mishnah. This is a Mishnah that details the pitfalls of greatness, of success, the dangers of hubris and arrogance and ego. It's dealing with a whole morass of problems in the human psyche. And therefore, perhaps, I can suggest that Hillel descends into his earlier language, the language of Babylonia, the language of Aramaic, a language of confusion, not clarity of Lashon HaKodesh, because that is where these types of qualities would originate from. These negative qualities, these negative traits would originate in that type of state. So since he's talking about negative states of being, not positive states of being, he's warning us against these negative states. He's speaking in a language of negativity, being Aramaic over the language of Hebrew, the language of redemption. And that essentially sets the tone for this particular Mishnah, a warning and an encouragement on the one hand to protect ourselves from an obsessive self-focus,
but never to allow ourselves to abscond from the responsibility to learn and to teach Torah and to spread Torah as much as we're able to. Okay, so that concludes our shir, Leila Nishmas, Azriel ben David, Zichron Levracha. I thank everybody for participating, and if there are any questions, I will unmute you now, and you are welcome to ask any questions. You can now unmute yourselves, and if there's any questions. Jack, I see your hand is up. Did you mean to raise your hand? There's a digital hand raised. Okay. Give one more chance for a question as we're waiting here. Wonderful. Have a wonderful day, and go teach the Mishna to somebody else.
Thanks, Rabbi. Thank
Bye-bye.
you.